Okay, it works. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. And we are now ready to start the fourth session about the intersection with ethics, philosophy of medicine, and race. And our first speaker is Sibylle Léonard, who's going to talk about the ethical implications of metaphysical models of pregnancy. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I need to turn that on, or is that? Okay, cool, thanks. Right, so first I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I also want to express my gratitude to the organizers of this workshop for giving me the opportunity to present today. And I apologize in advance for this quite ugly PowerPoint. I made it yesterday evening. I just wanted to have some visual support. So in my presentation, I will examine how metaphysical understandings of pregnancy can shape ethical approaches to pregnancy-related issues. And so the issues that we'll be looking at in particular are third-party harm, that could result in the death of the fetus. So I will also evoke miscarriage, but I won't really dwell on it. And then, of course, maternal behavior affecting the fetus, such as substance use and abortion. Right, so a central theme that will emerge from these discussions is the distribution of accountability and harm. So how do metaphysical views on pregnancy influence how we assign responsibility and our judgments about who is harmed in various scenarios? So since the cases I'm looking at are very concrete and for most of them legally regulated, I will be testing some of our ethical intuitions by also referring to legal cases. And most of these cases are from the United States, just to give you some background on the landscape of the intervention, with one Australian case as well. And also another warning, this is very new research that emerged after I heard about the BUMP project. I have a background in abortion ethics, and so I suddenly realized that all the ethical and legal arguments that I had been examining seemed to be rooted in specific metaphysical assumptions and seemed to align with a particular metaphysical framework. So I decided to delve deeper into these connections, and this is what came out. But I would say that my goal today is not really to provide definitive answers, but rather to raise some important questions and challenges that could be of interest also to some of you. So I hope that these reflections will spark an engaging discussion afterwards, and I'm of course eager to hear your insights and perspectives on these issues. So what I will do is that I will come back on the containment and the parthood view, and I will try to show how they have been concretely used or theoretically defended so far in ethical and legal terms, because we do find in theory and in practice this opposition between considering the fetus as a body part or as a separate person that is contained inside the woman. And one example of this in legal theory is offered by, Catherine McKinnon, who writes here, so as it is, the fetus has no concept of its own, but must be like something men have or are, a body part to the left and a person to the right. Nowhere in law is the fetus a fetus. Now, what's interesting here is that she actually links these views to political ideologies. Now, the idea that the fetus is a separate person, which seems to resonate with the containment model, is associated with right-wing stances, while the parthood view aligns with left-wing perspectives. And it's true that the parthood view is actually embraced by many feminist authors because it does empower the woman to make decisions about her own pregnancy. But I will try to show that there are also some ethical complexities here. Now, what's clear is that, on the other hand, the containment view, as Megan actually suggested yesterday, creates a maternal-fetal conflict and does seem to allow the delegation of decision-making power to third instances, external authorities such as courts or medical professionals, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Right. So to start with the containment view, the definition I rely on is the one by Kingma, of course. The fetus is not a part of a pregnant organism, but merely contained within or surrounded by it. So in terms of analogies, the proponents of this view liken the fetus to an object stored in a container. It's a famous yogurt in the fridge analogy. Right. So I think that in a sense, this view aligns with what has been identified as the separate entities model in law. In his book, Childbirth and the Law, John Seymour delineates three models, and this is the first one. And so here the fetus is seen as an autonomous entity that is distinct from the pregnant woman, yet still located inside of her. Now, this perspective leads to this strange situation where there are two distinct persons with two potentially competing sets of rights and interests within one single body. That's what creates the maternal-fetal conflict. And in medical practice, it actually manifests as the two-patient model that has been identified here by Susan Mattingly. And so here she argues that there are two patients. So this involves recognizing fetal patienthood, recognizing it as a separate from the mother. And so maternal and fetal needs are seen as, once again, separate and possibly conflicting. Right, so this division clearly might generate ethical dilemmas in pregnancy, in which case it is going to lead to split loyalties among doctors and courts who become arbiters between the two parties. And so they are tasked to apply principles of justice to balance the interests of the mother and of the fetus. Now, often what we see is that the mother is presented as a danger to her fetus, and there's this idea that this danger could be dealt with using force or criminal sanction. And so some striking examples of this, I'm using very extreme cases, but it's to show you how far we can go with this model, are forced or court-ordered medical interventions on unwilling pregnant persons, so forced cesareans, for example, or in the US, something that we've heard a bit about, criminal and dependency cases. So that's when pregnant persons are convicted during pregnancy and are put in jail, basically, because they struggle with drug addiction during gestation. So here the logic is that you put the pregnant person in prison to protect the fetus, right? Now, actually, Dorothy Roberts has done a great job at analyzing these cases, and she reveals how race and class play a very significant role in influencing the state's choice to criminalize rather than care, to punish rather than provide treatment or prevention services. Just want to put that here. Right, so what we see here is that there's a growing effort to extend child abuse laws to the fetus, effectively creating this sort of new legal category of fetal abuse. And the logic driving this movement is quite straightforward. If the state has the authority to intervene to protect a child from harm after birth, why shouldn't extend the same protection to the child before birth? So the fact that the fetus resides within the mother's womb seems quite incidental to this line of argument. But this does rejoin an argument that was also evoked yesterday, which is that the mother's relationship with the fetus is marked by this intricate biological connection, which complicates the notion of individual liability. And I'm going to come back to that also when talking about the parenthood view. Right. Now, what's interesting is that messed up a little bit with the animation. I don't know if you guys recognize her. The containment view is actually, can also be found in some feminist arguments. For instance, those that developed a libertarian defense of abortion, which was actually for a long time and still sort of is the dominant analytic approach within abortion ethics, and which is grounded in the principle of self-ownership. So the idea that you own your body. And so J.J. Thompson, in her famous article, A Defense of Abortion, argues that in cases of unwanted pregnancy, the fetus is like an intruder who breaks in and demands to be welcomed, sheltered, and nourished, despite the many challenging and disagreeable aspects of its presence. And so she enumerates the difficulties that are caused by pregnancy: nausea and vomiting, fatigue, swollenness, headaches, back pain, and so on. And so the question for Thompson is whether hospitality towards the stranger is a moral obligation or not. But she clearly conceptualizes it in terms of a host-guest relationship. Now, in that scenario, the woman is like the house. In fact, she's both the house and the owner. Thompson clearly writes that, I'm quoting her here, the mother and unborn child are not like two tenants in a small house, which has, by an unfortunate mistake, been rented to both. The mother owns the house, right? So here the fetus is presented as a guest or a parasite. And this means that in this account, as she is hosting the being in uterus, the pregnant person does possess the authority to assess the appropriateness of certain tenancies. And so abortion becomes a method of evicting or evacuating the fetus. Now, I do not have the knowledge to refute that claim and the self-ownership claim in biological terms. I'm sure there's a lot that could be done here, but I will refute it from a phenomenological perspective. So I argue that phenomenology can actually make ethical claims and significantly inform ethics, especially by deepening our understanding of lived experience, of embodiment, and the relational dimension of human life. Now, while phenomenology as a philosophical method primarily focuses on describing subjective experiences and consciousness, it does have, I think, strong ethical implications, particularly when it comes to how we relate to others, to the world, and to ourselves. And that's quite important in pregnancy, right? So according to a phenomenological approach, I will argue that the self-ownership claim alienates the woman from her fetus and from her body, right? So I'll have these two claims. And this here is a great book by Marguerite Lacaze. You can't see because there's a little zoom thing. It's called The Analytic Imaginary. And so in it, she does criticize the view that Thompson puts forward by arguing that this view actually denies any relationship of the pregnant person and the fetus beyond that of a clean home and good food. And so in this view, the woman is presented as the host to the fetal guest. She's not an active participant in its creation, but rather this passive vessel whose primary function is to sustain it. And so this defines pregnancy as a passive activity. The woman is a receptacle, a mere incubator, and a source of nutrition. And that function is sort of automatically, mechanically realized by her body. So pregnancy is presented as a biological process that happens to her, in her, while she is sort of waiting, expecting, as we say. And Iris Marin-Young has actually developed a very good critique of this notion of expectation as the temporal model for pregnancy in phenomenological terms. I'll be quoting her here too. So she tells us that we refer to the woman as expecting, as though this new life were flying in from another planet, and she sat in her rocking chair by the window, occasionally moving the curtain aside to see whether the ship is coming. The image of uneventful waiting associated with pregnancy reveals clearly how much the discourse of pregnancy leaves out the subjectivity of the woman. From the point of view of others, pregnancy is primarily a time of waiting and watching when nothing happens. Right, so now the answer to this is quite clearly that pregnant persons are not merely spectators of the physical changes that they experience. They actively engage in navigating these physical and emotional transformations that accompany pregnancy. And that's alongside all the changes that they make to their social, cultural, economic, and personal lives. There are great examples of this. We can discuss them later in the discussion. Right, so besides that, from a phenomenological perspective, I think we more fundamentally need to challenge this view according to which the body of the pregnant person, and of any person, in fact, is a mere property or possession, which would make it basically comparable to a house or a car, right? The argument here is that I do not simply own my body, I am my body. And so if we perceive subjectivities as shaped through bodily perspectives following phenomenology, we come to see the body as one's point of view upon the world. It's the means by which we experience and interact with the world. So changes to one's body or to one's perceptions of their body image would have very deep implications, much deeper than that of trespass or invasion of one's property. They are profound transformations that reshape one's entire experiential world. And so in that regard, one example that usually talks to everyone, because I'm sure everyone has experienced it, is that of the headache that is actually explored by Jean-Paul Sartre in L'être et le néant, so being in nothingness. And so here phenomenology emphasizes that the pain that is related to the headache is not merely a localized sensation inside one's head, but it's something that permeates one's entire world experience. So a medical examination of the body that's, aided by technologies might actually allow the identification of the physiological processes that are responsible for the headache, but it cannot capture the subjective experience, the sensation and significance that the pain holds for one's being in the world. The pain is going to affect the way you work, the way you eat, the way you talk with others, according to each person's patience or ability to deal with frustration, right? But so to come back to pregnancy, I think of this insight is particularly relevant when we compare, for example, the experience of willing and unwilling pregnant subjects, because where they undergo roughly the same biological processes, they will perceive, interpret, and integrate these processes in substantially different ways. So the phenomenological lens reveals that these bodily experiences are actually inseparable from the subject's overall sense of self and of world. Right, so to address these limitations, I'm going to turn to the parthood view. Now, this perspective asserts that the fetus and the woman are intertwined in a physiological, functional, topological, and immunological manner to the extent that the fetus can be considered as a part of the woman's body. Now, when I hear this, of course, I think that the parthood view raises also the question of what kind of part it could be. And it's interesting because in abortion ethics, I think many people know the argument by Mary Ann Warren, who compares abortion to a morally neutral act, like cutting one's hair. So could the fetus be compared to hair or to fingernails, right? something that grows and that can be detached without harm? Or is it more akin to an organ, so a functional, integral part of her body? And if so, which organ does it resemble in this analogy? Is it more like a lung or like a kidney? I'm not going to answer that question, but it's just food for thought, I guess. Right, so this view is actually reflected in a historically prevalent attitude, particularly before the advent of modern imaging techniques, when the fetus tended to be seen as part of the pregnant woman until quickening, which was the moment when it manifested itself to the woman, and then she manifested her pregnancy to the world, or until birth, actually, which was when the baby was actually discovered, right? So during this time, it was also practical to treat the mother and fetus as one unit, as the fetus was hidden inside the mother. And so that led to the one patient model in medical practice that we can oppose to the two patient model that I evoked earlier. As Susan Mattingly writes, unable to interact with the fetus in clear distinction from its host, physicians conceptualize the maternal fetal diet as one complex patient, the gravid female, of which the fetus was an integral part. Right, so in this understanding, birth is viewed as an event that produces a fundamental ontological change. Now, I think that to a certain extent, this also resonates with the single entity model that has been identified in legal discussion by Seymour. And so here's the idea that there is one entity that can be harmed and or held liable. So just like the parthood view used to be prevalent in medical practice until the middle of the 20th century, this view was also prevalent in certain areas of law. In tort law, for instance, so we're talking about third-party harm, here is a case from 1884 where Massachusetts Supreme Court Justice Wendell Holmes clearly writes that the fetus is not to be regarded as a separate, distinct, and individual entity. And so by saying this, he actually rejected the first legal claim to ever be brought on behalf of a fetus after a woman slipped on a public road, went into premature labor, lost her fetus, and subsequently sued the town for causing the wrongful death of her unborn son. She lost, as you can see, and that's because in determining that no civil suit could be brought by the child, Justice Holmes actually reasoned that the unborn child was a part of the mother at the time of the injury. And so it did not constitute a distinct death. It was not a person within the meaning of the law, and so no suit could be brought on his behalf. And so this decision would actually stand for the next half century without really being questioned. And we see it starting being challenged in the 40s. And this is here from the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. You can see that they write, it is true that the unity of mother and child has been relaxed in modern times, and that today, for some beneficial purposes, a child en ventre sa mère is considered, so in the womb of his mother, is considered as born. And this has, of course, been strengthened by the constitutional conceptualization of pregnancy in the context of abortion, which actually recognized the fetus as a legal person. Right, so the parthood understanding invites a reevaluation of the expectations that are placed on pregnant persons regarding their choices and behaviors that might affect the fetus as part of their body, right? So in the context of the organ analogy, it's hard to say that the fetus could be seen as a person because, I mean, after all, what organ can claim personhood? So this implies that the responsibilities of the mother are inherently tied to her own well-being, and the fetus is considered part of her physiological and emotional landscape, which seems to be a pretty appealing conclusion so far. So the framing shifts the focus from a potentially contentious relationship that we had in the containment view, where the mother must constantly monitor and regulate her behavior out of fear that she might be called out for not respecting the fetus's interests, to a more integrated relationship that does imply care. But it does pose the question of what I call future-oriented responsibility, because even though the fetus is a part of the woman now, if the pregnancy is carried to term, it will eventually become a separate person. So it does have interests, but in the future. Now, one attempt I have seen at addressing this is by Barbara Katz-Rothman, who I think is quite openly a proponent of what we could recognize to be the parthood view. I think she was in Bart's PowerPoint. And she openly claims that the fetus is a part of the pregnant woman. Now, she develops an interesting analogy where she suggests basically that the relationship between a pregnant person and her fetus could be likened to the relationship that one has with oneself at various ages and stages of their life. And so she provocatively asks, here, I'll quote her here, can I, in my old age, come to sue myself for behavior I engaged in when younger? What if my coffee drinking in youth turns out to cause disease in my old age? Can I sue myself? I won't continue, I'll stop here. But you see the logic, right? So, yeah. Right, so this does add a temporal dynamic to the notion of responsibility, but it's worth wondering how this comparison sounds. Is drinking heavily and destroying my own kidney comparable to, say, fetal alcohol syndrome? Is donating or selling a kidney comparable to abortion and or surrogacy? Can we really push that so far? So despite how connected we feel to our earlier selves, we nevertheless remain one person over time. So the choices and the consequences all belong to the same individual. But pregnancy introduces another being whose fate is temporarily tied to, yet eventually distinctive from the woman's, if the pregnancy is carried to term, right? So one flesh will end up giving rise to two different futures. Now, this does also introduce ethical complexities when the outcome of pregnancy is not live birth, particularly in how during pregnancy, it does seem to challenge the existence of a relationship with another by blurring the boundary between harm to oneself and harm to another. Is there another to be harmed, right? If it's just a part of myself. For instance, when third-party harm occurs, I'm coming back to the example I used earlier. So if third-party harm occurs and the woman loses her pregnancy, should it be considered as an assault on the woman, or so an injury on her, or does it constitute a distinct death? Now, there again, I think we can turn to legal disputes to see the ethical complexity of the matter. And earlier, I used this cold legal language, but here I will evoke a very concrete case that we actually find in this book, The Phenomenology of Gravidity by Jane Limer. And she opens the book by talking about the Australian case of Brodie Donegan, who was 32 weeks pregnant and was walking on the footpath, and then suddenly a minivan struck her, and her baby was stillborn because medical help took too long to come anyway. So the baby actually died without taking its first breath, right? So it didn't fall in the born alive rule that I evoked earlier. And this was in 2009. And at the time, according to the Crimes Act in Australia, the destruction of the fetus was listed as one of Donegan's injuries. So under Australian law, Zoe, which was the name of the baby, would have to have taken a breath for there to have been a charge of manslaughter brought against the driver. That's precisely the born alive rule. So if we look at the subjective experience of this, I'm going to read Brodie's testimony. So here's a little trigger warning. It might be a bit emotional. So do not hesitate to leave the room if this is too much for you. So Brodie writes, Zoe was not my injury. She was my baby. I felt her move. I'd been to checkups, ultrasounds, and had pictures of her. I had bought clothes for her, set up a room for her, and carried her for 8 months. We held her after she was born. We willed her to wake up. Her loss was harder to recover from than any of my other injuries. It did not heal as my other injuries. Her loss was felt by the entire family. Zoe was a daughter, sister, niece, cousin, granddaughter, great-granddaughter. She deserved her own charge. Right, so I think here we start seeing, right. Sorry, I have to go a bit quicker. Okay, so I think this also actually raises profound questions about the nature of loss in cases of miscarriage. It is not always the case that there is grieving, but when there is, for example, what is being mourned? Can we mourn a part of ourselves that is lost, or is it something more? Right, so we see that the part of you actually has a hard time responding to these cases. I also argue that it has a hard time, or could actually have some unsavory consequences in the context of abortion. I argue that it risks actually framing abortion as an act of self-harm, a form of self-harm. And that's because by conceptualizing the fetus as a part of the woman, it could lead to the implication that abortion is not simply the removal of a separate entity, but rather the destruction of a part of oneself. Now, this is an idea that came to me from work I have done on abortion in Germany. I had to read the whole Bundestag debates in 1992, and I remember that there was an argument that was actually brought from an SPD member who, while explicitly drawing on her own pregnancy, articulated this analogy by stating that Every termination of pregnancy is a kind of partial suicide for the mother, a destruction of a piece of her own self, and is also perceived to be exactly this by the pregnant woman, right? So this actually could also be related to some work, abortion is presented as a deeply existential and identity altering event. And I thought it was interesting to relate that also to some work that Suki Fen has done in the context of surrogacy. And she does argue that a whole actually cannot alter its part without causing some change to its overall nature. So removing a part from a whole is inherently more disruptive than simply taking something out of a container, which leaves the container itself unchanged. And while this might explain some of the ambivalence that women experience regarding abortion, I'm not sure we want to make that a possible claim, right? So I think that ethically, the parthood view risks falling short in cases where the pregnancy is interrupted before the other could actually emerge as something else than a body part, or while it might not be experienced as a body part, but as another that one does not want to keep in their body. So when harm is caused by a third party or through miscarriage, it might fail to fully acknowledge the loss of what the pregnant woman projected to be her baby. And when the harm supposedly comes from the woman herself in the case of abortion, it might overemphasize the situation, framing it as an act of self-destruction. Right. I think I need to speed up a little bit. So very quickly, to come back to McKinnon's objection, because you remember I opened with a quote from her, and she seems to think that both the parthood and the containment view are not satisfactory. So for her, the fetus is less than a person, but more than an organ. And she offers an interesting argument as to why the fetus cannot merely be considered as a body part from a legal and ethical perspective. Right, I'm going to quote her here. So she tells us that the fetus is ordinarily created through intercourse, a social relation through which impregnation occurs. Although some body parts are donated, as are some fertilized ova, no body part is created from a social relation, one between the sexes of that. And then she writes that no other body part actually gets up and walks away on its own eventually. And that's interesting because meanwhile, I have the choice to donate an organ. I cannot choose to keep the fetus inside of me as I could choose to just keep my organ. So it's important to account for the generative nature of pregnancy. Pregnancy is created by a relationship between two persons, and then it will result in a relationship between two other persons or more if we count the partner, the family, etc. But I think that does complicate the comparison to any organ. And the question, of course, is, well, what sort of relationship is it in the meantime? Now, in the two metaphysical models that we have seen, so containment and parthood, we can note the importance of defining clear boundaries. Either it's another bounded being inside the flesh of the pregnant person, according to the containment view, or it's integrated to the woman's identity, which is what seems to flow from the parthood view. Now, maybe there are ways to amend the parthood view to avoid these unsavory consequences I was talking about. I was also thinking yesterday that it could be interesting to explore how Margarita's view of a contained being within the boundaries of the pregnant organism could have different implications. The proper overlap view could also be interesting to look at in ethical terms. But my intuition is that we do need to have a more fluid relational understanding if we want to build what I would consider to be a feminist ethical perspective. Right, so a relational perspective would involve examining how women engage with their pregnancy, including what they experience and what meaning they project or are unable to or refuse to project onto their fetus. And this might explain why the death of a fetus can be experienced as a tragedy in the cases of miscarriage, but as a relief in the context of abortion. Now, to better accommodate this relational dimension, I think the model that I came across while I was doing my research was, of course, Anne-Sophie Meinke's process view of pregnancy. And I think that could be interesting to look at because she argues, as all of you know, that we should view organisms not as substances, but as processes. And so that does seem to be able to work with the not one, but not two model, right? So in this view, personhood does not imply sharp boundaries. There's a possibility of inserting a relational framework there, I think. And I, interestingly enough, found this as a solution that was proposed by Seymour in the legal context. So he thinks that this is the better model, the best model to account for responsibility and harm. And not only does it evoke the phenomenological accounts of pregnancy, where it's described as this, strange interrelationship we all quoted Iris Marion Young, and the fact that the pregnant woman experiences her body as both herself and not herself, as something that she cannot fully control, but also something that she does not passively experience. And so it seems to provide some solutions for the problems that we have identified above. So I'm going to finish by reading this quote. This model has the virtue of flexibility. It recognizes the existence and value of the fetus, but does not do so in a way that denies its separateness, and so makes it unnecessary to assume that pregnancy involves a conflict between two competing entities. It also enables the woman's interests to be taken into account. The model's recognition of the relationship between a pregnant woman and her fetus sets the scene for the protection of fetal interests when these are threatened or harmed by a third party, but it may produce a different result when they are threatened or harmed by the woman. Now, the model offers a middle ground. It avoids the rigidity and oversimplification that are implicit in the single entity and separate entities model. Right. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. We're going to adopt, as always, a new question, follow up. And yeah, I'm going to go.
That was really cool. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I was thinking about, this isn't really a question, but it's just like, so I was thinking about, I think what's really interesting about the case of the unwanted pregnancy on the parthood model is this idea, right, that, you could be kind of so alienated to something that's a part of yourself. And it occurred to me that what might be interesting to look at is like accounts of the phenomenology of illness, because I was just thinking about what would be the other cases in which you could end up in this sort of kind of hostile, antagonistic relationship with parts of your own sort of biological being. And it occurred to me that possibly some people in that literature might have written about like, what's that experience, right? Of suddenly becoming kind of going from being, one entity that you're kind of inharmonizing with, right, to becoming something that has maybe a part or that sort of suddenly seems to kind of turn on you in a way, and you become kind of alienated from your body in a different way. So I was wondering, because you seem to be sort of searching a little bit for like analogies, like what sort of part is it? Like what kind of thing we're talking about? And I was wondering if that sort of thing might be interesting to look at.
Thank you so much for this comment. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and especially because there's not much that's been done in phenomenology of unwanted pregnancy. So there's the work by Carl Lundquist that was evoked yesterday. But I think interestingly enough, what came to me now from what you said would be the tumor, right? The tumor analogy, which can be, the parasitic metaphor that can be seen a bit as problematic. I'm not sure how I feel about it. But perhaps, you wouldn't want to have that for all pregnancies, but perhaps it could account a little bit, for the unwanted pregnancy experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting. I worry that that you're conflating at least two issues.
Yeah.
One is the mereology, and one is the question about individuality, right, which you can and probably should run separately.
Yeah.
Because unless there's some a priori reason to suppose that one human cannot be a part of another human, you can have a part view with two individuals, with one individual, and anything in between, three individuals.
Yeah.
Ew, but you could. So those are separate questions. And a lot of the issues that you raise turn more on the issue of individuality than mereology. And the distinction between the part view and the containment view is a mereological distinction, not a distinction in terms of individuality. Those are distinct just in terms of parthood. And so then there's an interesting question about what kinds of obligations kind of stem from parthood. Like, do you necessarily own all your parts?
Yeah.
Because if you do, then that something follows, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just about separating stuff out.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I think it's also very interesting. I didn't evoke it, but I think we could also have this self-ownership view in the parthood view, right? So we could think that the woman can actually abort because she owns her fetus, right? Or she could sell it in the case of surrogacy. I haven't really explored that, but I think, could be in it. Of course, I'm not sure I subscribe to that view, but it would be interesting to think about it. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really liked how you set all of that out. But I'm extremely skeptical of the place where you end up,
Yeah.
right? So I think the concern with something like Saber's view is that it doesn't resolve anything, right? So we keep going back to like, okay, there's a problem with treating it like an organ.
Yeah.
For the reasons you say, that's the one view. There's the other extreme, which is the two view, all these other problems.
Yeah.
Well, somewhere in the middle then, what do we do? Well, vagueness, not one, but two.
Yeah.
I mean, how is that going to help the law, the medical practitioner, And so, I mean, I can tell you what I think there's also separate stories to be told. What is the relationship between metaphysics and ethics? Well, very complicated. But I think if you want to get something out of the metaphysical work, then the helpful thing actually is precisely to draw the two questions that Archie just mentioned and say, well, it's a part of the organism. What does that mean? It's a part of the body and it's an organism in its own right. And what you need to reject is a whole lot of stuff what the law thinks, namely that if something's a person, it's got its own body. No, that doesn't follow. Right? So every assumption in the law that hinges on you've got your own body, there's a state of non-interference, boom, it's got to go for pregnancy. But at the same time, the implication that if you're a body part, you're therefore just like an organ or hair. But what, nobody thinks that kidney donation should be regulated in the same way that like hairdressers are, right? So, and what that then gives you, or at least might go somewhere towards giving you, is I think that, absolutely brilliant quote you have in the start by McKinnon, right? Nowhere in the law is the fetus just a fetus. What we need is a whole legal framework that recognizes this, right? That you can have a body part and it's an organism and you just cannot model the rest of the law onto that. So that's, I think, I think that somewhere in that direction is where you need to go. And I worry that something like something in between doesn't do that, right? It doesn't give any constructive holds for people, whether they're ethicists or lawyers, who in the end have to say something when they encounter these kind of cases. Oh shit, that wasn't a question either.
No, but thank you so much. It's noted. I'll look into that. Yeah.
It's breaking my own rules. I'm sorry. Anyway, thank you. But I love the way you set it out. It was really great.
No, and I think you're right. That's why the conclusion was also so short. It's that I'm not sure yet where I want to take it, right? It's more going from the critique to something, to constructing something. And I think I've worked more on the deconstruction part than on the reconstructing. But
the construction bit, I think, is really hard.
It is. But it's also, I guess, the main part. So yeah, thank you.
You have a follow-up first, and then
Yeah, thank you. This is also something I'm just going to have to phrase as, what do you think about this? Which is just to add to what Elstein has said. I think you might want to think about the extent to which the, some of the different ways in which the law and the law in different jurisdictions deals with these sorts of questions doesn't hang solely on the different conceptualizations of Graviter and Foster. It also hangs on things like pragmatic considerations, like in tort, things like where is it meaningful to attempt to recover damages, or where are you just creating sort of a big circular mess that doesn't help anyone when you try and do so? And it may well be that that's already in your thinking, but what do you think about adding that into, just to make sure it's not all, you're recognizing those like pragmatic considerations, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I think it's very important. As I said, this is very new, so I think I haven't had the time yet to implement that. But I actually come from a very specific place. I was looking at abortion law in Germany, right? So it was very situated, and of course, you have to look at pragmatic concerns because the way the law is crafted also depends on ideological, pragmatical things. So yeah, you're right. I need to do that more. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I'm going to try and defend Thompson a
Okay.
little bit, and also the idea of self-ownership.
Yeah.
So I think that the way to understand Thompson is that she's saying the debate about abortion has spent loads of time trying to work out whether a fetus is a person.
Yeah.
And I'm going to grant my opponents that. So
Yeah.
basically what she's doing is she's
Yeah.
trying to say, let's grant the strongest position for people who want to say abortion is wrong, the view that the fetus is this separate, independent person. So I don't think she's necessarily endorsing a containment view so much as saying, I'm granting the containment view for the sake of argument, and that gets us a right to abortion. And in terms of defending the body ownership and the I have defended body ownership in print. I'm really keen on it. I think that loads of things flow from it. And people go, you don't own your body. You are your body, or you have a much closer relationship to your body than ownership. And I go, I never said that this was all that could be said about the relationship. It's more like, at the very least, you own your body. And so, yeah, I mean, if you don't own your body, who does? Like, it's more of a like, this is a resource, and nobody else can own it. I'm the one who gets to say what happens to it. So I want to defend self-ownership as not attempting to say everything that could be said about one's body, but as compatible with the phenomenology of being, in fact,
Right.
more.
Yeah, thank you. But I think actually, like, both of your arguments rely on pragmatic reasons, right? So Thompson is inserting herself in the debate, and I think her paper there's a reason why it's one of the most commented philosophy papers. It's that it's very provocative, it's very original. I'm just not sure how far you can take the analogy, right? How you can compare pregnancy to being attached to a violinist for 9 months, right? So comparing such a different relationship to the relationship between two adults, strangers, who are basically attached to each other on a bed. I think there's a lot of layers of critique that we could address to her, right? But I definitely think that her work was very useful. And again, in pragmatic terms, I think it has served a lot. And that's also why when I teach about abortion, it's one of the first things that we're going to talk about, because that's a striking argument that is going to convince a lot of students, right? Now, about the body ownership issue, look, I agree with you, and I think we could actually define ownership in a different way. And I think Catriona Mackenzie has a very interesting paper on that, where she actually takes the notion of identity that you find in the work of the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, and so where she says that ownership is not ownership like property, but it's ownership like, in the sense of it being constitutive of one's self, right? So I think you could define maybe ownership differently in a way that does account more for the phenomenological aspect. I think also, I forgot the name, but I had read a really interesting paper where a feminist writer was actually explaining that self-ownership, for example, was very important for slave women in the US, and that, that they defined themselves in terms of still owning their body because it was the last thing that they had, right? So I think that it has also been a good argument in terms of emancipation in very specific contexts. But there again, I think we want to separate maybe the pragmatic argument and then what we could actually make into a moral, or deeper, like, ethical justification or claim. Yeah.
Okay, we don't have much time and we still have 4 questions, so I recommend you to be quick. And I guess we're gonna steal 5 minutes since it's a really nice Q&A session. We're gonna steal 5-7 minutes from the break if you're okay with this. But yeah, please be concise.
Thank you. It was a really interesting talk. I just wanted to go back on your discussions of like medical ethics more specifically, because I think there are instances in which obstetric violence, for example, is carried out against pregnant people, but it's not always done under a justification of like balancing the interests of like pregnant person and baby. So I'm wondering when things such as like epistemic silencing or kind of medical gaslighting happens, do you think there's kind of an ontological basis to that, in that women are still potentially, especially if we take the containment view as being seen as like quite normative in medicine, do you think ontology still kind of play a role in that, or do you think it's more just to do with sort of being a part of the broader social category of being women and experiencing misogyny? Yeah, so just like the role that ontology potentially plays.
Well, that's a great question. I think I need to think about it. So maybe as we don't have much time, we can talk about it later, if that's fine. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's super interesting.
By the way, I lied. We still have 9 minutes.
Okay.
So, yeah, so thank you so much for this talk. I thought it was great. I was really glad, for lack of a better word, that you're bringing in pregnancy loss as well into this discussion. So thank you for doing that. I do have similar concerns to Elsaline about the relationality view as sort of, I'm a big fan of the relational view. I like kind of Hilda Lindemann's like calling into personhood and holding in personhood. I worry about it as a legal standard because I think it's going to put the burden of proof on the woman.
Yeah.
And so then there's going to be a lot of like epistemic injustices going on, a lot of like unnecessary, like how, you know, how did you relate to your fetus kind of thing. So I'm a little worried about that. So that's just by way of like commentary, but I'm curious how important you think it is. So we talked a lot in this conference about like what pregnancy is, right? And we've had these mereological notions. We've had questions of individuality. We've talked very little about when pregnancy begins. But I know that there are like insurance cases out there, for example, where you had a fetus that didn't have a heartbeat and insurance companies said this was not a pregnancy. Therefore, we don't have to pay any pregnancy related costs. And so I'm wondering if you have any, I mean, this might just be something to like consider for the future when looking into these issues, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how our notions of the beginning of pregnancy play out with respect to particular models of pregnancy or, you know, in the law or in insurance cases or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm sorry, I don't think I have a response for you right now because I was looking more at the outcome, you know, or at the end of pregnancy and not at the beginning. But that's such a good point that I need to think about. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Well, so maybe something that Amber said is partly answering my question. I wondered if you had any views about why there's resistance in feminist literature, which there does seem to be, to the idea of maternal fetal conflict. It's always struck me as slightly, because as I really like the fact that you really kind of undermined the early slide about the right taking the containment view, because it seems to me that a lot of the kind of coercion stuff is to do with having a view that says, oh, well, how could there possibly be any conflict? Like, we've got completely aligned interests in it. It kind of strikes me that I wonder why feminists why we'd be reluctant to embrace the conflict.
Yeah.
Just as an anecdote, David Haig, who gave a talk at a symposium, he does work on a very explicitly just an evolutionary sense of maternal fetal conflict, and his comment was that he gets lots. He's got quite a high profile. He gets an enormous amount of stick from anti-abortionists and pro-choice people. They both think that what he's saying is opposing their positions. So I think that the conflict, I'm really interested in them.
Right. So I think that the reason why feminists have a hard time embracing the conflict view, I mean, the conflict perspective would be because that does imply that you need a third party to judge and to arbiter, as I said, regarding the interest, which interest should take over. And I guess that this whole idea of adding a third party into the relationship to judge and to maybe, as I said, use violence or criminal sanctions on the woman is not the best. At least, yeah, that's what I would argue from a feminist perspective. Do you see what I mean? Like, it's, yeah. Especially because it's also this idea of bringing women into places of, again, male-dominated scrutiny and control, right? So courts and doctors are, associated with that as well. So, yeah. See fingers, yeah.
Yeah, so just a very brief follow-up on this. I wonder if maybe something that Megan was talking about yesterday about, the metaphor of stakeholders and shareholders could be
Yeah.
useful in looking at this kind of idea of conflict and the arbiter.
Yeah,
Just maybe.
thank you.
You want to take the other follow-ups?
Sorry, I hope this is a follow-up. I mean, I think Jonathan poses a really good question, right? It is striking how both models can be used, because either it's conflict, somebody else needs to arbiter,
Yeah.
or it's like, well, of course the woman would want the cesarean section, because isn't the well-being of a child that we actually remove from her after birth and she'll never see again, isn't that what every woman wants? So both the harmonization model and the conflict model can be kind of subverted. And I think it comes back to this notion of like, the fetus needs to be fetus in law and in ethics. We need to both recognize that, yes, you can have competing interests. The cesarean section is bad for me, but not for the fetus. And I'm either willing to make that sacrifice, and that should be recognized
Yeah.
as such, or not. But also the asymmetry. There may be a conflict, but just as in the context of my family, I decide about the
Yeah,
conflict.
absolutely.
So, we need to drill in to that relationship. And I think then, I think some of these things are really helpful to do that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think also the notion of sacrifice that you use is very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have time for the last question.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. And I saw you mention near the start conflict of interests, and it makes me think of the cases where you have legal practitioners withdrawing their services in giving abortions. Do you think that the not one but two model implemented in law gives a slippery slope of making it more acceptable to act out your conflicts of interest, to not give the service, to withdraw your services in giving abortions? It makes it more almost acceptable for these practitioners to turn away people.
All right. So are you talking about conscientious objection? So basically when they say that they don't want to practice abortion because it goes against their moral view, or what's your, sorry, I'm not sure I understood the example that you're using. On what ground do they refuse to give their service?
Yeah, so this I couldn't say in general, but if not one but two is in law, I think it's still quite open and vague, and I don't see a clear direction of it going without.
Yeah, right. So I see your point. So basically the idea is that we still want to make a positive claim on the fact that the service should be provided, eventually paid for by the state, et cetera. Yeah, I think I also need to work on that, to turn it into a positive right, we would say, but I could talk about a positive claim. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's thank together our speaker and